This program is made possible by the New York law firm of Zalman and Storman, who specialize in the field of personal injury law. Welcome to Lawline with your host, Alan Schnorman. Mr. Schnorman is a distinguished trial attorney, author, and lecturer. Each week, Lawline will bring you the most knowledgeable experts in the field of law today. And now we introduce our guest and our host, Alan Schnorman.
Welcome to Lawline. Less than a decade ago, if someone was arrested for killing an abusive spouse or lover, they probably would have ended up in jail. This is no longer necessarily the case. Society as a whole has become more aware and more sensitive to the problem of sexual and physical abuse and the devastating consequences to the victim. Today we'll look at the issue of domestic violence as a legal defense in murder trials. Our guests are Ira London, a criminal defense attorney who has successfully used this defense in murder trials, and Dr. Julie Blackman, a social psychologist who has testified as an expert witness for defendants who are victims of abuse. Hello, Ira. Hello, Julie.
Hello, Alan.
Hello. Give me a hint. Talk to me. Domestic violence. What's the definition of that?
I think Julie would be better equipped to do that.
Julie?
I'll deal with the defense of justification.
Domestic violence is violence that goes on between family members. The most common forms are battering of wives by husbands or abuse of children. It's physical violence explicitly. A lot of people who are physically abused, who are hit or slapped or kicked or punched, are also victims of emotional abuse, of verbal abuse, of nasty language. But the specific definition of domestic violence involves getting hit, struck, physical abuse between family members.
So we're not talking about psychological now. We're talking about actually being assaulted.
That's right.
Right. Physical contact.
And Ira, how is that now a defense to criminal charges of murder, of assault?
Well, most people are familiar with self-defense. In other words, if someone is beating you up, you have a right to defend yourself.
Justification.
That's exactly right. Self-defense and justification are pretty much from the same family of permissible criminal defenses. In a domestic violence situation where a husband has been physically abusing a wife and he goes beyond what he has customarily done to her, the wife is justified in using reasonable force to meet his force. It sometimes escalates into homicide, and that's where you have the battered woman defense and justification and self-defense. They're all in the same family of defenses that one would use in such a case.
Julie, do you have circumstances where the victim is not being confronted at the time, and then later on she shoots or does, and I say she, I'm assuming it could be either spouse, but
It is mostly women that come under this rubric of the battered woman syndrome notion, although some states have called it battered spouse syndrome. But it's very rarely men. And there are situations where women strike back when the violence against them has stopped, but they still want to invoke, as I was suggesting, the notion of self-defense, of justification, even though the danger is not physically imminent. And then the nature of the defense is to raise the question of whether or not it was psychologically imminent.
That leads to the case that Julie and I worked on.
Tell me about it.
I think we worked on it for a year and a half. A young Russian woman was a member of a family of emigres. They came to this country when she was about 12 years old, from Russia. She was the eldest. At the time of the homicide of her father, she was 17. Her brother was approximately 12 or 13. They had a baby about 3, and the mother. The father had physically abused the entire family from the day the marriage began.
I mean, when he was mad, he would slap them or something of that nature?
It didn't need for him to be mad. He was, in the words of an ant, a monster, a virtual monster. There were things he did that are incomprehensible. In any event, about a year before the homicide, he began to sexually abuse his own daughter. He began to...
17-year-old.
The 17-year-old. He began to abuse her by crawling into bed with her, exposing himself. He actually, on several occasions, masturbated in her presence. It began to escalate over a period of a year. At no time did he ever commit what would classically be known as a rape. He had not done that. And on the day that the events of the homicide occurred, he informed her that he was going to take her to Atlantic City and, quote, make her a woman, close quote. She didn't need to go into detail with him as to what that meant. She knew instinctively what he meant, and she said she was not willing to do it. At that point, he informed her that he would murder her mother, his wife, and she would have to take over the wifely duties. So either way, she was going to be made a woman. He passed out on the sofa of the family apartment after drinking a bottle of vodka, or half a bottle of vodka. He was an alcoholic. She went to her mother in the family store. The family had a shoe repair store, and asked her mother to help. She told her mother what was going to happen. The two of them came back to the apartment. Now, the reason this becomes justification and not classic self-defense is at the time she administered the blows which led to his death, he was sleeping in this drunken stupor on the sofa.
And what did she do?
She took an axe and struck him with it until such time as the blows were fatal and he died.
The mother was there?
The mother was there, and as you'll later learn, actually, as we later found out, Julie and I discovered together, the mother administered most of the blows.
Now, Julie, you examined her. What did you find?
Well, the description of her life that Ira provided is something that she related. This 17-year-old was really, in the context of her family, the protector. I mean, she kind of kept the father from abusing the mother. There'd been a time when they were still in Russia where the father had beaten the mother so badly that she'd been hospitalized for a month. And so this girl saw her role as one of trying to keep peace. And when he told her that he was going to make a woman of her, that was further than she could go. Up until then, she had tolerated much sexual abuse from him in an effort to keep peace in the family. The other thing that's important to note in the story is his use of alcohol. Alcohol abuse is a very common part of these experiences, that the men are very often alcoholics. And the moments that lead up to their deaths are almost always, in my experience, times when these men are drunk.
Alan, in addition to what we've said, there were other forms of abuse. He had the mother and the daughter, who was the defendant in the homicide case, do crimes for him. He sent them into supermarkets to steal for him. Not for the family, but for him. He had the daughter accompany him on a burglary. He burglarized a synagogue. And he had the daughter go with him so that it would look more innocent. I mean, Julie just touched upon some of the abuse.
This testimony came out at the trial?
Oh, yes, all of it.
And you testified at the trial?
Yes,
Julie.
about
And what was your opinion? I mean, what caused this?
Well, the nature of expert testimony in these cases goes to the question of whether or not the victim, in this case the defendant victim, shows psychological signs of having been injured. It's almost corroborative to support the idea that she was in fact abused and that she displays the psychological symptoms of having been abused. And there are 4 of them, and I testify about those 4 characteristics that are present in battered women and were present in this girl.
Share them with us.
The first is something that's been called learned helplessness, and it's something of a misnomer, because it really is not the idea that one is simply helpless and lies in bed, but it's a belief, and it's the belief that one cannot make the violence stop despite one's best efforts. So that no matter what you do, if you comply with all of the requests and you try to, in the case of wives, keep the house neat, make dinner, it's never enough. And the
Even if you go outside the home and go to other people. They went to a shelter. No one followed it up. The defendant in this case actually complained to a nurse who lived in their apartment house and said, "What do you do with a father who sexually abuses you?" She didn't use those exact words. And the nurse just walked into her apartment and did nothing about it.
What else do you have to show?
Okay, a second characteristic is something called the diminished perception of alternatives. It's again a feeling or a belief that no one will help, that no one can help, that you're trapped, that there's nowhere to go. It's partly a psychological experience and it's partly a social reality. Because very often when these women turn to neighbors or seek shelter, the response is inadequate and doesn't prevent future violence. And a piece of it is psychological. It's the feeling that no matter what you try to do, it's not going to work, and you've tried before and you're trapped. A third characteristic...
Reinforced by society's reaction to what you're saying. You know that most people... It's very interesting. In this case, most people who learned about the case said, oh, well, he wasn't her real father. Do you remember that? How people would react to that and say immediately...
What do you mean he wasn't a real father? He was a
Not her
stepfather.
biological
cannot
father.
comprehend.
Stepfather.
But he wasn't. He was her
He
biological
wasn't a real
father.
father. He was her biological father.
Well,
I don't see
although
what
if
difference
you-
it makes
if
anyway.
If you look
but,
at the
a
statistics
stepfather or a
on...
real father.
Well, it does make a difference. The girls who are at greatest risk of sexual abuse are the daughters of stepfathers.
I see.
At far greater risk, but this happened not to be the case, although it's...
I'm saying from the victim's point of view, it's still a father. It's still a father figure in the home.
But people find this so incomprehensible. They're so unwilling to accept the notion that a father would sexually abuse a daughter. Their first reaction is, well, he isn't her real father.
All right, let me ask you this. I know there are two other points you want to get to, but let me ask you this to clarify something in my mind. We're all familiar with the insanity defense. I was insane at the time I shot her. I shot him.
Right.
We're all familiar from TV with the momentary insanity defense. The circumstances surrounding the occurrence made me insane at that time, but I'm fine now. But this type of defense, is it sort of like a momentary insanity, or is it sort of an insanity defense?
No.
Share that with us.
Okay, it's totally different from insanity, which is the failure to recognize right from wrong. The victim defendant, the victim accused homicide person,
The person who shot the other person.
or
Right.
led
The
to their
defendant,
demise,
Right.
is not insane. They know right from wrong. They simply have a feeling based on all the factors that Julie is going into that there's no other way to end the violence, to save their life.
Julie, the only thing that I have feeling is that shouldn't there be some standards here where the person still has a requirement? I mean, the person is taking a life. Is taking a life. Shouldn't there be some requirements that they do everything possible, including going to the proper authorities, with the agencies that are set up to deal with this?
Well, most battered women these days do. I mean, there's really substantial outreach. It's a problem that's changed in terms of public awareness over the last 10 or 15 years. It used to be if you talked about battered women, people didn't know what those two words together meant. And now it's really very much a part of public awareness. What we see, though, is insufficient response. And so that even in the case of women who call the police or get orders of protection, we see them not working the way you'd hope that they would.
Of course, I don't want to give the public the misguided belief that if a spouse is being beaten today, that she can go out and kill her husband.
No, absolutely not. And the suggestion that women coming to trial today are quite likely to be acquitted, a majority are still convicted, just not as high a majority as were convicted in the past. And we're seeing changes around clemency decision making, like Governor Celeste out in Ohio, who granted clemency to, I think, 35 women in the prison system in Ohio, based on the discovery while they were in prison that they had been battered, and that offered a mitigation of their criminal
You know,
acts.
Jean Harris comes to mind in New York State, a case that we all are familiar
Of course,
with.
she was not physically abused.
No, she wasn't. But I think, and Julie may disagree with me on this, I think in today's climate, there would have been a greater likelihood of her having been found guilty of a lesser crime than murder. She was convicted of murder, not manslaughter.
Of course, I know there was some drug involvement there that she felt, if I recall, that he had given her prescription drugs to and had addicted her to some drugs on Jean Harris. Is that correct?
You're talking
I don't
about
remember
a
that.
depression resulting
Yes.
from, say, diet pills or something like that?
Whatever the medication was.
I don't recollect that.
No, I don't either. My recollection is that her defense at trial was that she had been trying to kill herself.
Yes.
And
I
that
see.
they had struggled over the gun and had gone off and she'd killed him. And that was the presentation of her case. But the way I understand Ira's point is that there's a different social climate about intimate relationships these days, and I think she dealt with a stronger notion that intimate relationships are sort of positive and good and loving, and there's more general awareness today. The movie The Burning Bed, or other made-for-TV movies, or movies that you see in the theater, that suggest that an intimate relationship can be tragic.
Okay, we have to take a break now, but I wanted to consider now, Ira, I know you represented Joel Steinberg in the Steinberg matter, and in fact you examined Hedda Nussbaum involving the same matter, and we'll discuss that right after this break. You're watching Lawline. I'm Alan Schnorman, your host. Stay with us.
After dating the guy forever, you think I could tell him anything. Why is this so hard? I'm really scared.
It takes a lot of guts to tell someone he's too drunk to drive. But you can do it. Just say it. Because if you don't, there may be nothing left to say.
Kevin, I'm gonna drive.
Take the keys, call a cab, take a stand. Friends don't let friends drive drunk.
When your employees train with the National Guard and Reserve, they learn to be better team players, better decision makers, and better leaders. It's training that makes them better at serving our country. And better when they come back to work for you.
Bill's back.
Be a hero. Give your employees the freedom to protect ours.
Hello, you're watching Lawline. I'm Alan Schnorman, your host. Today's topic is domestic violence as a legal defense in murder trials. Our guests are Ira London and Dr. Julie Blackman. Now, Ira and Julie, I was discussing before the break that you were both involved in the Lisa Steinberg matter. You representing Joel Steinberg, and I believe, Julie, you examined Hedda Nussbaum for the defense of Hedda, the potential defense. First, can you give us, if the Steinberg trial would be tried today in this atmosphere, would it be any different?
No. The issue of battered women did not really come into that case as a defense. I mean, if anyone was a battered woman, it was Hedda Nussbaum. Joel was the accused, so it wasn't a defense that would help him. Although it did come in as a factual issue in the cross-examination of Hedda. And I think Julie and I may not agree on Hedda Nussbaum. I don't know. We've never discussed it. My sense of Hedda Nussbaum from the case and from the cross-examination is that she was not, in my mind, what we know as a battered woman.
Did you have a problem with the credibility?
Yes, a
Julie?
major problem.
Well, so much of what is known about Hedda really is known to everyone because she got so much television publicity. And she certainly was a physically battered woman in the sense of having been badly brutalized.
Julie, I don't disagree with that at all. She was a physically battered woman. The videotape of her when she was arrested is still very vivid in my mind.
Well, I met her in person just days after, and I had never seen anyone who was that battered. I mean, she was really just horribly tortured and brutalized. She required major plastic surgery to reconstruct her face. Her lip was split down the middle from having been battered. Her facial bones were displaced. I mean, she was really just
Yes, you could go on. She had a leg that was gangrenous.
It was really
that
awful.
had she not received medical care would have had to have been amputated. I
Well,
mean, we don't need to go any further than all this.
Did you have any doubt that this was done by Joel Steinberg?
It would not be appropriate for me to say,
Julie?
since that maybe Julie.
Did you have
could
any
say.
doubt that this was done by?
I had no
Joseph?
doubt, and I think what's important to know about Hedda and to know about the situation at that time is that she made a tremendous impact in terms of awareness about that kind of violence in middle-class families. I mean, the fact that it went educated.
He's an attorney.
Right.
And she was a professional. She was a college graduate, editor of a book publishing company.
It really kind of, I think, blew open the secret, the notion that this happens to poor people or people so different from us that it isn't relevant. And here was someone who was, people who looked like the judges and looked like the attorneys and looked like the upper middle class from which they came, and yet people who are horribly involved in domestic violence.
Okay, now,
But was she a battered woman, Julie, in your mind? A classic battered woman?
Probably not, because the abuse was so much worse, and the damage to her was so much greater. In fact, in some ways, the fact that she got so much publicity and was so horribly battered has been a problem for other battered women who've come through the legal system, because she created a kind of standard.
where is she today?
My understanding is she lives in the New York area and is working and caring for herself and living on her own.
Now, first, the question I have is, relate the violence that occurred to her to basically what happened to Lisa.
Well, essentially, I mean, Hedda was never indicted in relation to Lisa's death, and the reason why she was not indicted was because the district attorney became persuaded that because of the damage done to her, because of the battering damage specifically, that she had been truly unable to act to protect her child. And that's a notion that's come up quite often, actually, in my experience, in cases that involve the deaths of children in families, where the woman is also battered, and they're more often indicted for a failure to protect. But this notion comes up as a way to understand why these women fail to protect their children.
Why couldn't she just walk out of the house and say, I'm not coming back to live with you?
It was more dramatic than that. You're talking about before Lisa was
That's
battered.
correct.
She did several times.
But she came back.
She came back, and that's why. And she also had economic independence. You know, we never finished the four ingredients of a battered woman.
And actually, the third one really comes into play here directly.
Please.
One of the things that's most fundamental to battered women's psychology is the idea that they live with ideas that are inconsistent, internally inconsistent. The man they love is also the man they fear. And that fundamental inconsistency appears throughout their thinking and is a real contributor to why they remain in these relationships. Particularly for someone like Hedda, who had economic independence, it's the feeling that it will always be this way. No, maybe it'll change. There's nothing I can do about it. Well, maybe I can do something. Maybe tomorrow I'll apply my substantial intellect to this problem and I'll solve it. And he'll stop, and I'll fix it, and I'll come up out of this hole, and I'll be in a new place, and I can make that happen.
And then on the other side is, he's my savior. He's my savior. He will save me. There's the clinging to that belief.
Is it almost like a neurotic feeling or some sort of mental instability involved?
Well,
where you have this...
I wouldn't label it as neurotic, because it's so much the normal consequence of that kind of violence. It's any awareness that brings pain comes to us like the waves in the ocean. It comes in and you feel it and it's almost intolerable, and it goes out again. And it comes back and it goes out. One of the things that's been most astonishing for me to learn about battered women is that they don't know they're battered. That there's a way in which painful knowledge is denied and is only held on to briefly, and then it's gone. And
Yes.
How common is this in our society?
very common.
Oh, very.
Are any statistics?
The statistics that are most widely regarded are statistics that come out of the University of New Hampshire Family Violence Research Program, and they put the rate of family violence at around 28 to 30% across classes. That is a general statistic. There's evidence to suggest that it's higher where stress is higher. In poor families, the rates of family violence are higher than that, and some people put that number at a half in poorer families. But the 28% comes out of a nationwide survey, a statistically randomized survey of American families.
Other than that, are there any other groups that are higher than others?
Well, poor people are the people who are most at risk. People of color are more likely to be poor in this society. They are more at risk for
You talked
violent
about
families.
alcohol involvement before. In most cases, is alcohol involved?
When someone dies, in almost all cases, when an adult dies, in almost all cases, there's alcohol abuse. When children die, actually there is not. The same pattern of alcohol abuse is not present in families where children are beaten to death.
Okay, let's assume there's a party out there watching this show,
Yep.
and they're victims of this type of abuse. What's your advice to them?
Call a victim's hotline, get help, call the Victim Services Agency, call local shelters, reach out, get out.
Call information, ask for Victims Hotline. There is one in every county in this state.
Ira, is it confidential? Is there a possibility that the person will feel that they receive more beatings from their spouse once they learn that they've reached out for these groups?
It is possible.
What's been your experience, Julie?
Women who leave are at substantially greater risk of being killed than women who stay. And it's one of the reasons why women with severely violent men remain, because they fear the death threats. They fear threats not only to themselves, but to their families. I testified in a trial recently in Pennsylvania where the woman said that she really wanted to leave and take her 3 daughters with her, but her husband told her that if she left and she went into a shelter or into some kind of protective program, that he would find her parents. He said, you can't take everyone with you. Whoever you leave behind,
You
I'll
would find
kill.
her parents and kill
And kill
them?
them.
Alan, there's another whole category of cases. I mean, we're talking about family. There's also the whole category of the fatal attraction cases, which I've handled as well.
Share it with us.
Well, the one case I handled is classic. A boy and a girl are engaged to be married. She begins to see things in him that she's not happy about and begins to ask him about it. And he becomes very stonewall about it. I don't want to talk about that. And ultimately she comes to the conclusion that she does not want to live with him as a life partner and says, I'm going to break the engagement. And he says, no, you're not. You're going to marry me. You are going to be my wife. And she says, no, I'm not. Now, at that point, you have 2 people who have a disagreement. It can lead to a point where one or the other is going to have to do something definitive. The last one I handled was a young woman who gave him back his ring and said, I'm not marrying you. He broke her door down at, it was early in the morning.
Ryan, what happened?
He broke in and he started to abuse her physically and tell her, we have to talk about this. And she said, this is not the atmosphere for us to talk about this.
Quickly, in the remaining moment.
She stabbed him to death as he was trying to strangle her.
And what was the result?
She was found not guilty because it was a classic self-defense. And fortunately, some neighbor saw him break the door down. So there wasn't any doubt that he was a burglar.
Julie, I want to get to that 4th ingredient.
Right, the 4th has to do with the victim's knowledge of the abuser's violence. That is, she knows the pattern and the nature of his violence and knows what's extraordinary.
Does
Has a sense of the continuum.
Does the violence have to go on for years?
No.
No.
No. In fact, most homicides occur between young couples. It involves young people.
Dr. Julie Blackman, thank you for being on Lawline. Ira London, thank you for being on Lawline. And as always, this is Alan Schnorman, and thank you for watching Lawline.
You have been watching Lawline with your host, New York trial attorney Alan Schnorman. Mr. Schnorman will be back with you next week at the same time. If you have any questions about this week's program, please write to Lawline, 63 Wall Street, New York, New York, 10005, or call area code 212-432-9111. This program is made possible by the New York law firm of Zollman and Schnorman, who specialize in the field of personal injury law, located at 63 Wall Street in New York City.